Well, welcome everyone. This is a panel discussion run by PERCoGS. My name is Devin Schaefer. I'm the Secretary of PERCoGS, and I'm very happy to introduce our panelists today. We've got Katie Ansel, Ramon Bartolome, and Geraldine Cotran. And we're going to start by having our panelists introduce themselves, and then we've got lots of questions for them about writing. So Ramon, would you like to start?
Sure, I'm Ramon. I am an assistant professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Utah. I run a physics education research group. I primarily do research focused on equity, inclusion, as well as some work in research development and also studying the field of PER itself.
All right, well, thank you. And Katie?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Katie Ansel. I'm got to change, just recent title change. So I'm a teaching assistant professor at the University of Illinois. I graduated in the before times, but just barely. So I can talk about that if we get to it. And yeah, so a lot of what I do has been triage on making labs work online this semester, but my kind of research area is in the introductory physics labs, giving students freedom to make choices and developing their creativity and kind of sort of expertise in the lab.
Thank you, Katie. And Geraldine?
I'm Geraldine Cochran. I'm at Rutgers University. I'm an assistant professor of professional practice in the Department of Physics and Astronomy in the Office of STEM Education. I teach one of the introductory physics sequences for engineering majors. I also teach in a couple other departments as well, math, as well as a women and gender studies course from time to time. My area of research is physics education research.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. So let's talk a little bit about your writing process. I guess we could start with how you manage your time when you're writing. Whoever feels comfortable can just jump right in.
Well, I think I'll start then. It takes me a while actually to write something. I actually like to sort of write it in my head before I'm ever ready to put it on paper. For some reason, it feels more real or something when I actually type it up or put it on paper. So before I begin writing something, I think about it and think about it and think about it and probably discuss it with my collaborators, colleagues, sometimes my friends before I ever sit down to write it. So when I actually do get to writing, it's usually I'm usually at the point where I'm like almost finished, or I can actually have a draft of something down. For some reason, I get clarity at night when the world is a little more quiet. So I've also come to realize that I have a writing time that works for me, and that's usually in the late evenings or early mornings.
All right.
So that's interesting to me because in some ways I'm the opposite, and this may be I mean, everyone has their preferences, but I have found that getting started writing is really hard because, like many people in academia, I'm a perfectionist, and I get very caught up in I want to write something that's perfect to start out, but I actually do really well by just like doing like word vomit on the page. That sounds very gross. But for me, I found that it really helps to just be like, I'm going to just write for an hour and I'm just going to write down the things I think I need to say and not worry about if they fit yet or if they like sound right. And then like once I get it on the paper, then I can start actually massaging it into a real draft.
I think that I'm actually somewhere in between Geraldine and Katie because I like to start with a written outline so that I have a vague idea of what the paper, the grant, whatever it is going to look like. But then I like to think about it and write it in my head. So dog walks are very popular for me to do this. Working out is another popular venue for me to do this. And I try to go through it in my head. And then at that point, I'll sit down and try to write. And I'm actually the opposite of you, Geraldine, because I write in the morning rather than at the night. For whatever reason, the morning is like my time. And then the night is like, I can't write well in the night. I don't know why.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. And so you've talked a lot about kind of how you kind of think about what you're going to write and how you get started. What do you do if you're really stuck? Like if you started a piece, but you're having a hard time finishing it, you're not really sure where to go. What do you do?
I go to with definitely if it's work that's going to be co-authored, then definitely I would go to the co-authors. For some reason, I'm better when it comes to talking and talking things through with people. So if I'm stuck on something, um, I'll either talk through the idea with someone or send them sort of my incomplete draft. So I have a circle of friends slash support system slash accountability partners that can read over my stuff and give me feedback and say, well, I think this is what you need to do to wrap up, or where you may want to go next, or how you can thread these two ideas together. So having people that you're willing to share your writing with before it's finished is super helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, similarly, oh, sorry, go ahead, Ramon.
No, you go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, I think for me, it depends on the way that I'm stuck. Because there's certainly the like I'm stuck on this idea, which I agree. Like I'll absolutely, like Geraldine, I'll take it to someone who is a collaborator or someone I trust and ask for their feedback. Sometimes if I'm just trying to like get the things on the paper, I will throw flags for myself. I have some, while I was working on my dissertation, I definitely sent drafts to my advisor where with like blocks of red text being like, I need to say this thing here, but I don't know how can we talk about this when we meet. And so that's been really helpful for me to throw up some kind of a flag to basically say, come back to this after you've thought about it a little bit. I also get stuck in terms of just like especially when I've put something away for a while, to come back to it and get started on it. And that is, at least for me, one where I just have to decide I'm going to do it. Which is actually like I say just, but it's not just, except it is. I'm being incoherent, but I found that when I'm stuck in terms of the motivation to like set the time aside for writing, to some degree, I do have to just decide I'm going to do it and not make a big deal and be like, I have this time. This is what I'm going to do with my time. Put on some music, put on a Pomodoro, and just be like, this is what's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely reach out to colleagues and collaborators as well, or just folks that are good thinkers about problems. The other thing with me though is I'm probably the opposite of a perfectionist that Katie stated herself to be, because I'm also happy to get, if it's a publication, I'm happy to get feedback through the peer review process. So if I don't think that it's quite perfect, I'm actually fine with submitting it being an imperfection, and then getting that feedback from reviewers, which oftentimes I find really helpful.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. I know for me, it can be really hard to finish something because I always feel like it's just not quite perfect, but the idea of like getting some feedback is a good one. Yeah. All right.
I was just gonna piggyback off what Ramon said. I feel that way when it comes to like writing proposals for research projects. I'm like, sometimes I feel like because they have a deadline where, I mean, sometimes our publications have deadlines as well, but with grant proposals, they generally have a deadline. And so for me, a lot of times I'm like, I'm gonna make it, as good as I can make it by the deadline, and recognize that if it is not selected for funding, I will hopefully get really good feedback from the reviewers and then, submit again. So I tend to feel that way when it's that kind of writing.
That's a great perspective, and it kind of keeps it positive, because I think a lot of times people get very stressed out about, is this going to be accepted? Is this going to be funded and all those things? But taking that perspective of let's get some feedback at least is a good one. All right. So the next question I have is, how do you adjust your writing for your audience? That's kind of a broad question, but you can take it wherever you want based on your own experience.
So I've written in a number of contexts now because I've written for the National Science Foundation for proposals. I've written for Fulbright applications. I was a consultant in the private sector, so I had to write for clients. I've had to write in the U.S. Department of Education, working with lawyers, which is a completely different situation. And you do have to figure out what the purpose of your writing is, and then essentially speak in that direction. Because when I was doing client-faced writing, transforming research for university administrators, it was all about practicality and applicability. Whereas when I'm writing a proposal, it's about making the argument for why the research has to be done now. Whereas if it's a publication, it's a technical piece, and every bit of information has to be in there. So sometimes the length and the precision will vary depending on the audience. But for me, it's important to figure out what the goal is and then chase that goal as closely as I possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just echo what Ramon said there. I think of it as the same if you were having a conversation with a particular audience, thinking about how you would word things so that the message that you're trying to convey to the people in the audience actually is delivered or gets across to them. And also thinking about how does that tie into what they want to hear? So why are they listening to you if it's a conversation? But if it's some written piece, then why do they want to read this? How is this relevant to them? And so I think that dictates the way in which I try to write. Ramon went through the specifics of it, and I would just say I agree with what he said on the different kinds of writing, or writing for the different kinds of audiences. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the next question I have is pretty related. When you're thinking about writing an academic piece, how do you decide whether it's going to be like a journal article or a book or a book chapter or an editorial? How do you decide what the avenue is going to be for delivering that information?
So with book chapters, at least with the book chapters that I've worked on thus far, there were calls out for the book chapters. So it was kind of already determined. And so it was more so me realizing that, seeing a solicitation out there and realizing that my work fit into the solicitation. Mm-hmm. With journals, I think about who the readers are of the journal. Being in physics education research, right? Physical review PER is research focused. And so if it's a study that I would think is a more so traditional research study, then I think I would consider that journal. Whereas if it's more practitioner focused, then maybe it's the physics teacher. And maybe it isn't really particular to physics. Maybe I'm thinking about, something that's happening within the classroom, but it's really applicable to someone in any discipline. And maybe I'm looking at other journals. So I think, again, about the audience and where the audience is most likely to read it. And then it's not just scholarly writing. So I'll also write pieces for the community. So that's working with local organizations, as well as sometimes writing research briefs and statements that I just want to be circulated within my institution so that people know what I'm doing or how this work might be relevant to classroom practice. So one thing I think is recognizing that there are lots of venues and ways to disseminate our work, but then thinking who are the stakeholders and who motivates the work that we do.
That's a great answer. Ramon or Katie, would you like to add to that?
One small thing maybe that I can add is that certainly relevant to grad students in PER is sort of when is something a PERC paper versus something for like PhysRev PER. Mm-hmm. And so I know for me, one of the interesting things is kind of keeping an eye out for experiments or questions or little pieces that feel like they can be adequately contained within a 4-page document. And that's something that is, it's almost kind of fun. Like, I mean, that sounds a little trite to be like, it's kind of fun to write a PERC paper sometimes, but sometimes it is. It's like, oh, there was this little thing and I'm not planning to turn it into a whole thing. And so that can also be part of the decision, is kind of the scope of the work for something like a conference proceedings versus a full publication.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. All right. So to follow up on Geraldine's answer, you said that with the book chapters, a lot of times there's a call out for a chapter to be written. And so Brian is wondering, where do you find these solicitations?
A lot of it is a who you know situation, unfortunately. And there's, the reality is that there's actually a lot of nepotism, favoritism, and internal connections that lead to these. So recently, I mean, Geraldine and I are working on a chapter for a PER handbook. Geraldine's actually the editor of the section. And we were just emailed by somebody that knew of our work and asked us to participate. Is that fair? No. Is that unfortunately how things work? Yes. So I think the big thing that we can do is when we individually hear about things, that we tell our colleagues and as many people as we possibly can about them, in order to be a part of the change of actually making more equitable access to these opportunities to get our words out there.
Okay, thank you.
I will echo everything that Ramon said. That's exactly what I was planning to say, which is why I started with a smile and a because that's generally how I found, that's actually how I found out about the last 4 places where I wrote proposals for handbook chapters. I will add though that sometimes they're also shared on like professional listservs as well. Some of the solicitations come through that way. So if you're on these listservs, then you also may find out about it that way.
Okay, and what are some of the professional listservs that would be good for graduate students to join to start thinking about these things?
I would say definitely start with the main PER ones. So like there's GPER, which is through American Physical Society. There's PERTIG through AAPT. And then the odd informal one is the Young PER listserv, but that you can get on once you have your PhD. You can rotate on to PERTIG and then you rotate off of PERCoGS.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so continuing on this idea of the, the handbook chapter, how do you approach writing a handbook chapter as compared to an academic article?
Well, I think for me, it can be different than some academic articles in that your focus is not so much your own work or a narrow sort of focus the way it is generally with a journal article. It's more so a synthesis, generally. It's a synthesis of what's been done in an area. And then it's kind of like either you're focusing on maybe some gaps or you're making some statements about what's needed to move the field forward. I remember the first time I read a handbook chapter, it was a sign that we were going to go through every chapter of this handbook when I was in graduate school, taking an education course on curriculum and instruction. And I just remember one of the authors has my last name, no relation that I'm aware of, but this author had my last name, and I remember reading because there were so many references. There were like over 200 references for this one chapter, and I was like, how could one person have read so many articles? How is that possible? I was like, so good thing there's already a Cochrane, because I would never do that. And now I have. But yeah, that's the thing. You're actually looking, not only, it's not just your work, and it's not things often related to a particular work, but a particular area. And the idea, at least with handbook chapters, which is different than maybe other book chapters, but with a handbook chapter, the idea is you're giving someone who's probably either new to the field or who's learning the field an idea of everything that's already out there.
And I have a related question. So, I mean, writing such a thing that's really kind of a literature review can be very challenging. Like you said, there's 200 references. Like, how do you manage all of that? So I wanted to ask the panelists, what your strategies are for writing that kind of a literature review, whether that's for a handbook chapter or whether that's for your dissertation or you know, something else. How do you manage all of those references and organize the information to put it into your literature review?
Okay, I'll say something here, but I'm going to be honest and say I don't do this. I'm going to say what I wish I did because I hear that other people do it and it sounds great. Um, Using some of the tools, I think RefWorks is one and another is EndNotes. So people use that to sort of organize their references, and you can like you have the citation there for you in a nice format, and then you also can put notes so you remember kind of what the piece is about and like how it's situated in other, you know, situated in different fields, or how it might be relevant to different contexts. Like basically you can give yourself enough information and you can put tags so that if you have a particular keyword, you can pull all those references up very easily. That is what I wish I did. I know others who use Google spreadsheets or some type of Excel, and they organize their references that way also, so that it's easy for them to search through and say, okay, these are all the things related to this topic. And they also have their notes attached so they remember what each article is about. That is what I wish I did. What I actually do is scribble stuff on envelopes and also Microsoft Word, which is probably like the worst because I can never find stuff when I'm looking for it. But those first two things, that's what I hear other people do that works really well.
Thank you. And Ramon and Katie, would you like to share some of your strategies?
I guess I'll jump in. So I do actually use a citation manager. I use Mendeley because that's what I liked when I started, and now I'm in so deep, I feel it's too late to change. So when I do read a paper, I'll throw it in there, at least so I like have some record that I've read it before. As far as, I guess there's two pieces. There's the keeping track of what I've read, and then there's the like finding more stuff. Which feels, the latter feels very overwhelming because I think, you know, being in PER, there are so many different disciplines to borrow from when you're trying to understand why what you're doing is important and like what it means. And so some of it is just getting a sense of what those journals are. But going back to the first thing, I do try to use some folders in Mendeley. I do try to keep some notes when I remember. A lot of it comes down to sort of remembering who the authors are of some of these papers, or of, as I'm sort of working on something, going back, and at least when it's in Mendeley, I can kind of search through the abstracts, and if I sort of remember what the title was of the paper or what it was about, I'm able to find it again pretty well. And that's worked pretty, I feel like that's worked okay for me. And then, let's see, as far as finding the papers, to some degree, it's, I like to keep an eye out, especially on the PhysRev, PER, just kind of when new articles come out, I'll just kind of skim through and check for the ones that I think might be relevant to me. And then I do a lot of, and I'm sure this is not just me doing this, but a lot of sort of like rabbit holing through references. So, and I'll kind of go in both directions. So if it's a new paper and they cite something that I think might be interesting, you know, it's like one sentence, so you're never really sure exactly, but I'll go and I'll look through the references and say, oh, well, these ones look like I should check them out, and I'll kind of start following that. Or if there's a paper that's a little bit older and I think it's important, I will try to find papers that have cited that paper and see kind of like where have people moved forward from this. And so I don't recommend spending all your time doing this, but it is kind of a nice way to spend some time when you want to be like productive, but in a meandering way, and just kind of see what you can get. Because I've found some really powerful stuff that way. It also does get you sort of an idea of what journals to look at, is when you look at what other people are citing. Although, of course, they'll miss stuff all the time. The other thing is to just talk to people. I've gotten really great paper recommendations from peers, from colleagues, from just conversations at summer meeting, winter meeting. People will be like, oh, have you read this person? This person talks about it. And then all of a sudden I have 10 new papers to read.
That's great. Thanks, Katie.
I also wish that I did what Katie does and what Geraldine says that we should do, but I'm much more messy. I do keep an EndNote file with all of my references in it. But as far as like notes and stuff, in theory, I would have an annotated bibliography, but in practice, I keep one in my head. And then I also like keep one with my peers. I'm constantly emailing people. Do you remember that paper that someone wrote? I think they're from FIU, you know, like, and that's how I handle things, which is not a best practice. I will say though, that when you're trying to like publish, you know, multiple publications a year, plus half a dozen grants, plus an inside higher ed piece, plus your curriculum and coursework that you're teaching, you end up being forced to take these shortcuts because there is no, the reality with an academic career is there's no way that you can do everything best practice perfect. So we have to pick and choose what we do. And for me, this seems to work. And then if I'm writing a paper and I have some big pit hole, then I'm like, oh, I really need to write about, you know, power and privilege or some sort of identity or something. I then turn to Google Scholar and do what Katie suggests, where I go down the reference rabbit hole and I'll just spend a couple hours reading abstracts, reading the papers that are relevant, figuring out what pieces I need to build my argument, recreating my argument, and then do it that way. So I do it kind of as I go, which maybe is not the best practice, but it's worked.
I feel like oh, sorry, go ahead, Geraldine.
Okay, all right. I was gonna say systematic reviews of the literature. So if you do have the time, then it's very beneficial to others if you actually use a search engine and go through the process of doing a systematic literature review, which you then can publish. And then if you're not the person doing that, going to these reviews of the literature or to a meta synthesis so that you can also see how, see a more exhaustive list of what's out there. Yeah.
Okay. And when you say a systematic literature review, so Katie kind of talked a bit about like following that chain of references. Is that kind of your method, or do you have some other methods when you're using a search engine to do that systematic literature review?
Okay, so there are a number of different methods that you can use for doing a systematic literature review. The main thing when it comes to systematic literature reviews is that you just lay out the process that you're using, and you're consistent with how you're selecting articles when you decide on that process. So often it's using a search engine, determining what words you will use in your search and how you'll connect those words, if at all, and what kind of articles you're looking for. Maybe you want to include dissertations and theses, maybe you don't. Maybe you want peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed. Maybe you only want things that are published in a certain time period. So basically you lay out your criteria, and then you also lay out the criteria for how you'll choose if you include an article or not. So your inclusion exclusion criteria. And so you basically use that method. You follow whatever steps you laid out. You'll eventually identify a lot of articles. Hopefully you were careful in making your keywords so that your search isn't overwhelming. But after you've laid out, once you've decided on all the articles, then you may say, I'm just going to use a title search, and by title, usually you do title and abstract, decide if you're going to include it or not. And you also want to make criteria for why you included it or excluded it based on what you read in the title and abstract. And then after that, once you've decided on like that final list, you categorize all of the references in that final list based on whatever might make sense. Maybe it's methodology, maybe it's population within research studies, maybe it's kind of research study, theoretical versus experimental papers, like whatever the category is that makes sense for the kind of review you're doing.
Okay. And what is your preferred search engine?
I tend to use PERCoGS and Google Scholar.
Okay.
And EBSCOhost. Awesome.
All right. Does anyone want to add anything more about literature reviews, or shall we move on?
I think I did want to just clarify one thing because from Ramon's response, I think I made it come across like I'm a super organized person. And I'm gonna put it out there that like obviously you find the thing that works for you, and if you're sitting there thinking like Katie does sound like she just has all her files in order, I'm definitely the like kind of person who has like a bunch of piles of crap on my desk, and I just know where everything is in each pile, but that doesn't mean it's neat. Like I'm a messy like I'm that kind of person, so it's a chaotic organization, and if that works for you, cool.
Yeah, it sounds like one of the key points here is figuring out what works best for you. And there's probably not a one size fits all way to do any of this. But it's always good to hear how different people do things and get some ideas and try things out. So, all right. So next I'd like to ask a little bit about working with editors. Ramon, you mentioned something at the beginning about submitting your article and then getting some feedback from the peer review process or maybe from journal editors. I want to ask what role a journal editor or a guest editor plays in the publication process, and how can you work with them to ensure that the process goes smoothly?
You know, they can oftentimes be make or break for whether or not your article gets accepted. So I think it's important that you do your best to work professionally with editors. And I've actually recently learned a really good strategy from my colleague, Dr. Tim Atherton at Tufts, and how to handle reviews. Because normally what I have done when I get reviews is the positive ones I completely ignore, and then I just go for all the negative ones. Mm-hmm. And I probably should not be doing that, and I should have never been doing it. But one thing that Tim taught me was pull out all the positive aspects, and then when you send the letter back to the editor, basically thank the reviewers that said positive things and reinforce like all the positive things they said to kind of help the editor along with understanding why the article is valuable. And then after doing that, go back to the things that people said that you should improve upon, and then talk about those things, and then obviously how you address them. You know, one thing to remember too is that sometimes your reviewers and sometimes the editor are wrong. So, I mean, pick and choose your battles carefully, but if someone says that, you know, something that you just completely disagree with or just is flat out wrong, you can push back on that, right? You can't push back on everything, but some things you certainly can. So I would always encourage people that if you're using a particular style of research that isn't traditional in the field and you're trying to pioneer that, you're going to get pushback. And oftentimes that pushback can be a sign that you're doing something right. And that really has been the story of my career, because early on there weren't a lot of people that were doing like really in-depth qualitative stuff and pulling from gender studies and queer studies. Now that it's more common, and there were people like Anna Danielson and Allison Gonsalves, and there were people that were doing this, but not many, and they weren't necessarily publishing in physical review. So that has been an opportunity to help educate the community about the value of this research. And if you're doing that kind of work, that might be something you have to do. But I'd love to hear from Katie and Geraldine about this.
Katie, you want to go first?
I mean, my experience is actually pretty limited because I got really badly burned on the first paper I submitted, and it's been slow going since, I'll be honest. And that's something I'm working on now, is to like get the courage up to like go at it again. I would say for graduate students in particular, get your advisor to go to bat for you. I think that's a big thing, is that like it maybe shouldn't entirely be on you to be the one pushing on the editor, but your advisor really, the co-author, should really be going to bat for you in this case.
Okay, I'll say some things from the perspective of someone who's recently had some experience being an editor for both conference proceedings and also 2 themed issues as a physics teacher. I think it's difficult. Reviewers are so incredibly important for editors. And I say that because I think it's difficult for me, at least it was difficult for me as a newbie editor, to not be the reviewer. Like, we initially read these articles and then we assign them to reviewers. And so for most articles, that's pretty easy for me to think about, right? I try to break up the article into three things that I find were important, because we generally had three reviewers, and think, who do I know has expertise in this, whether it's related to the research design or the population, or if they're doing an intervention, the intervention that they did. And I think, who knows the literature in this area? And so trying to find those kinds of reviewers. So generally, if that happens, and I definitely have seen that happen for papers that I've submitted, the reviews come back focused on different things. And I feel like that is the best case scenario, because now, you know, you have people who are sort of looking at it with very different eyes because their expertise is different. But that may mean that the only feedback you get on the design is the negative feedback, and you don't have someone who's really focused on the design saying all the positive aspects. So one of the things I think when I get the reviews, especially if, you know, they're not as positive as I hoped after I, you know, shed a tear or two, to take a step back. And again, I have to go to my circle of my team, my crew, my support system, and sort of talk it through with them. Mm-hmm. Something else that I recognized as an editor, I'm like, I was so worried. I worked, you know, Gary White is the editor of the physics teacher, so I've been working with him, and I'm like, is this bias? Am I being biased? Because if I find something problematic, I'll literally be like, who else is going to point this out? Because they need to say this, and I'm not sure that the editor should say it. But there are some things that I find tricky when it comes to what the role of the editor is, because if there is something problematic, it does need to be pointed out, but not everybody may realize that. And I think editors do have an opportunity to add these things, and at least I've seen it happen with things that I've submitted, where they're like, in addition to this advice from the reviewers, you should also consider this. And so I've seen it, but for some reason, in serving in the role, I was always very worried about doing that. There was one other thing that I wanted to say that I think was important. When it comes to citing, people of color are not cited as often. Women are not cited as often. I should say people of color are not cited as often as their white colleagues and peers. And women are not cited as often as their male colleagues and peers. There's research showing that. And so another thing I think about is whose work I might be missing. And then I have to ask myself, why am I missing that work? Hopefully it's reviewers who will point this out. I feel like this is tricky for me, again, in the guest co-editor role with Gary, because I also feel like, to some extent, I don't want to tell people, you need to cite this person's work, and why aren't you reading this, right? For, you know, people choose particular citations for a certain reason, especially if multiple people have said the same thing. But you want to cite at least one person, and it's not something where you can go back to some seminal work that you know is the work that you should cite. Like if you're talking about a theory, right? There's generally something you know to cite for the theory, but other times it's just like people stating, or people who are doing similar kind of work, right? And you want to say like, yes, this has been explored by other people in the field, and this is what they found. Well, then it's probably like 6 or 7 papers you could reference. And if it's not the type of article, like the physics teacher, you know, there's a word limit there, I think about 2,000 words, and the reference list is usually not as long as, say, something like physical review. So you're not going to cite all 10 people. And so deciding who to cite, I think is something else that now, having served as a guest editor, I'm a little bit more conscientious of as a writer. And again, it's thinking about, if I'm called on it, like, you should see this, or why haven't you cited that? This has even happened with proposals. Reviewers have mentioned, like, I noticed your literature review didn't include this person's work. And I'm like, literature review does not have to include everybody's work. But then I have to ask myself, why was I either not aware of it, or why is that not the work that I decided to include? So it's good to reflect. Yeah, that's all I got to say about that.
All right. Well, I guess continuing from the editor's perspective, what can be done to help an article succeed? So what are some of the main qualities of a successful article versus an article that's unlikely to make it through the review process?
It depends if you're talking about just the pure writing. I mean, because it boils down to the study at the bottom of it, and then the point of that you're trying to make. So if you have a strong point that you're trying to make that preferentially has not been made before, and it's backed up by really good, rigorous methods. And I don't like using the word rigorous because people use that as a cudgel against a lot of people, including myself. That's the core. But then on top of that is the actual writing, and I like to write to the bone. So I like to have as little prose as possible. I like to just write straight to the point. So for me, that works, but that doesn't necessarily work for everybody because there's also, a linguistic style that we each have.
I think that actually what was discussed earlier about choosing the right venue is one of the important things, because sometimes you get a rejection and it's not because what you wrote is not valuable or even that it's not good. It just may not be the correct contribution for that particular journal. Because it may not be for the audience of that journal. So recognizing that if you get that kind of feedback, like this is not, I forget the category, what they call it. They usually say there's usually some question in like the standard review templates about, fit for the audience, or is this of interest to the community? Even in the proceedings, it's something, some wording, something like that. And so recognizing that if that's some place where you scored a low, or the reviewers and editors don't feel like it's right for that audience, recognizing that doesn't mean that the work isn't valuable. It just, you need to find a venue that is going to put that work in front of the kind of audience that you're hoping to have a discussion with via your work. I think the other thing is there's this whole idea, especially when you're writing proposals, that things are supposed to be like new knowledge, advancing knowledge. Like in NSF, they have this intellectual merit category. And sometimes I don't think, it's not always about being novel or, advancing things, but sometimes it's a different sort of reflection on it, which in a way is new. What am I trying to say? I think I'm trying to say understanding the value of your work, because it takes a lot of work to put together a manuscript. And so you clearly thought it was valuable if you put that time in. So kind of going to like the core of it and your motivation. And when you recognize that, like if you take time to reflect on that before you do like your final submission, especially when it comes to maybe writing the implications section or the discussion section, which for me are the hardest sections of a paper to write, going back to that core and that motivation, because honestly, that's probably the last thing that the reviewers are going to read, right? It comes at the end of the paper. And if you can do that for yourself, if you can go back to what got you excited about this, what motivated you want to spend hours writing this thing, and make sure that you try to make that come across in those sections, I think that also is very helpful.
All right. Well, thank you. So I'd like to switch gears a little bit to some broader questions about writing. So I want to ask, this is a question from Deanna. How do you cope with stress about writing, especially when you need to meet a deadline?
Not well.
My response is laughing, not because the question is funny, but because my answer, I think like my true answer is kind of funny. Um, when it comes to deadlines, if there's something that I think is important enough for me to try to meet a deadline, then I've kind of put in my head that I'm going to, again, it's just what I said about proposals, give it the best I have until that deadline. And then that's it. And it's almost refreshing in a way when you have something that you know there's a set deadline. Renee Michelle, she was a postdoc at FIU when I was a grad student. I remember talking to her about it, and she was like, even when it comes to like job applications, she's like, Geraldine, submit it, don't think about it anymore. It's done. And so deadlines kind of help with that, because you know that once the deadline's hit and you've given it what you got, that's it. But for me, I have more stress around things that don't have deadlines, because that is when I will get into putting it off, wanting to make it better, trying to, as Katie talked about, perfect it. And those are the things that cause me the most stress. Whereas I know for other people, having the deadline is stressful, but for me, I feel like personally it's the other way around, especially because that's how I end up with things for 2 and 3 years that I haven't published, because I don't have to publish them, but I want to. And how I deal with that stress is two things. One is advice I was given, which was to have my work in different stages. So for those in PER, we do, many of us are doing human subjects research. And so I only want so many things where I'm designing the research, where I'm still conceptualizing and thinking about the design. I only want so many things in the phase where I am preparing an IRB application. I only want so many projects, because I'm excited in a lot of things, and I'll just take on a ton of projects. And then the other thing is I only want so many things, where I'm in the data collection and analysis phase. And that way I can say, I only want to really be focused on writing 2 at most 3 things at a time. So if all of a sudden my IRB applications are starting to get approved and I'm starting to do data collection analysis, now I have too many things that are in that phase. So that motivates me to sort of push one more thing to at least the submission stage, and then I can wait and do reviews. So I use this kind of, what do you call it, the management tool. I've used a ton of them. I've used Aura, I've used Asana, I've used all these different little project management tools, but I actually use a project management tool. I use Kanban Flow, that's the name of it. I literally type it in daily and I went blank. But anyway, I use Kanban Flow so that I have these different columns, and my goal is to not have too many things in too many columns. So when I do get too many things in the column and I have too many things in that writing column, I can then say to myself, just focus on this one, because this needs to get to a new column. And that sort of helps me with managing the stress. At that point, instead of having all these ideas in my head and all these projects, I can tell myself to just focus on one. And in terms of the deadline, working backwards and deciding what needs to be done by when is super helpful.
All right. Well, thank you. Ramon and Katie, do you have anything to add about managing stress?
So I'm also very deadline motivated. I agree actually that like there is a certain level of stress that like I need to like really like get to business and get it done. But there's also something freeing, as Geraldine was saying, in like the deadline is when you're done. Like that's when you're done. So like done enough is done, like done enough is done. And so there's something kind of freeing in that, to just be like, well, this is what I can do with the time that I have. It's also really interesting for me because something I've noticed is that I certainly, I'll try to work in a way that like allows me to like sleep and exercise and like take care of myself and take care of my family, because that's been an added constraint for me in the past couple of years, is that I have a toddler. And so like weekends are not an option for working usually. But as deadlines get closer, then, I'll start to talk with my partner and we'll figure out like if I need to put more time, that, if I underestimated the time that I need to get done enough, then we will start to, and this may have to happen this weekend actually with the AAPT talks needing to be recorded. That then there is some wiggle room to push, but it's, I don't know. I think being honest, knowing where you're willing to compromise, but also like I don't know, like some people, like, for example, will write their dissertation where they basically don't sleep for 3 months. And I just, no, not happening. I'm not doing it. So maybe there's the balance of the stress to get things done, but also the planning ahead enough so that you don't abuse yourself in as the cost.
I definitely subscribe when it comes to research proposals. I definitely subscribe to the just push it out model, because the reality with research proposals is some of it is just statistical luck. It's a luck of the draw of who's reviewing it, you know, what other proposals get submitted, et cetera. So when it comes to like National Science Foundation proposals or you know, any proposals that I submit, sometimes I just recognize that I just have to push it out, because there's like this minimum bar of what the proposals need to look like to be funded. And then after that, it's just like random luck of wild animals on old-fashioned typewriters pulling them out, and then those results are who gets the funding.
I also want to say that when it comes to stressing out about writing, so you know, it differs from person to person, especially depending on where you are in your field. Maybe you are, you know, you're a graduate student, you're thinking about how much you want to get done so that you can go on the job market, or maybe, you know, go into a postdoc, or then, you know, at some point, if you go into a faculty position, you may be thinking like, oh, I'm on the tenure track, I want to publish so much, and, you know, each year I want to have this many publications and it needs to be in this kind of journal. Like I know people who've gone through that. I don't go through that. But I'm in a non-tenure track position, so I don't have that stress. But I think in general, missing deadlines is okay. It depends on the person and it depends on their goals. So part of it is realizing that if you can't make a deadline, then maybe this is not the opportunity and you go for something else. Even if this was initially where you planned on submitting, or this is the call that you planned on responding to, or this is the focus collection that you planned on contributing to. I've definitely been in places where I had that hope and then it didn't happen. So I think part of not letting it stress you is realizing that like there are other things that are important to you, and if this is causing you stress, and I've learned that there's a difference between positive stress and negative stress from listening to a psychologist talk, but if this is causing negative stress, then maybe you don't meet that deadline. Maybe you look for another opportunity. And also deadlines can be arbitrary. So I haven't seen, for most proposals at least, especially depending on if they're going to like a foundation versus a professional society, you know, you may have a deadline that if you don't meet that deadline, your stuff will not be accepted and reviewed. But then sometimes deadlines are arbitrary. I've definitely seen it where deadlines have been changed. So if I come close and I know, like, I think, oh, I just need a couple more days, I will definitely reach out to editors if it's a theme collection or something like that. I mean, with the theme collection I'm working on with the physics teacher, with Gary White, like, we definitely like we got way more than we expected, and so, you know, the deadline for that was pushed out some, and we were able to accept even more, or consider even more articles than we expected. So don't hesitate to reach out to editors if it's something like that, or you're trying to get into a themes collection. And I definitely tell students that when it comes to like writing for positions, what do you call it? Internships, opportunities, you know, Ramon mentioned fellowships. I've done that. I applied late to a fellowship and I got it. It was late and they knew it was coming late. So sometimes it will still be considered. Yeah. So my advice on that. I'll be quiet now.
Thank you. And Jardine, I believe you had to go at the hours. Is that right? Okay. Well, I wanted to just give you the opportunity then to head out. But thank you so much for all of your advice and thoughts on this topic of writing. It's been very helpful.
Thank you for having me, and thanks, Ramon and Katie. It's been great being on the panel with you all. Bye, everybody.
Bye. All right, well, we have a couple more questions. So I wanted to ask you, what has it been like writing during the pandemic? Or if you want to broaden that, what has it been like working during the pandemic?
I guess since Ramon gave the "you go first" gesture, honestly, I have not been doing a lot of writing during the pandemic, and I'm just learning to be okay with that. I mentioned, I think at the beginning, that I defended March 6th. So that following week, they're like, people could defend virtually, and then the week after that, they were like, everyone needs to defend virtually. So things really changed very quickly for me. In part because I do have a toddler and we didn't have childcare for 2.5 months. And so I just went into emergency mode, whereas I had thought, oh, I'll defend in March and then I'll spend the rest of that semester queuing up papers from my dissertation. And that just didn't happen because I went into, I might be able to find 4 hours a day to work, maybe, which is not enough to really even maintain like a normal teaching load. And so, between that and kind of, like I said, this triage for the lab courses, I haven't found some of it is not finding the time, and some of it is just being so exhausted that I haven't been doing it. But so for me, writing in the pandemic is to stop now and say, I feel like I'm in a pretty secure place. I do have childcare, and we're coming up on the end of the semester. Everyone's losing their minds right now, but we're coming up on the end of the semester, and I was actually just doing my little chart thing that I do. There's like 6 weeks, and from starting Monday, there's 6 weeks until the next semester begins, which, wow. And so I have all this opportunity and this open time to not worry about what happened before, but to say, I have this time now, let me do what I can with what I have. So it's, I guess, maybe saying, if you haven't done any writing, you're okay and you're not done, and just let's all just mourn this year together and look forward. And yeah.
I'm on the exact opposite side of that. So I'm more or less alone in a big house with a dog. So I have done extensive amounts of writing. I wrote my first ever solo paper. I've never written a paper by myself. I wrote my first ever solo paper. I have submitted probably 6 NSF grants, right around there. Yeah, about 6 this year. One of which has already been funded, 1 denied, and 4 still in the review process. So I've taken advantage of the fact that I'm not traveling, because normally I'm traveling every single month, multiple times a month. But now that's not happening. So I've used all the extra time to write, and I've tried to use this time to reflect and build up a portfolio, because I've recognized that once the pandemic ends, I'm traveling and I'm taking holidays and I'm doing non-academic things. So I'm actually trying to do as much academic work now as I possibly can to front load everything, so that when the pandemic ends, if it ends, I hate saying that, but we do have to say that if it ends, it might be endemic, that I will actually be able to like have more of a life and do things that I can't really do currently. I think the tough thing though is a lot of people have taken this approach, and the competition is a little bit harder, and it's also super gendered, because you see people with kids not being able to do the same thing as people without kids. And unfortunately, because of the culture we live in, childcare, because obviously anybody can have a kid, right? But we live in a culture where the caregivers tend to be women. So I mean, I think Katie and I are actually an example of like male privilege on my side, because I don't have to deal with these kinds of things, which is an advantage and an unfair advantage. But that's how it is right now, unfortunately.
Well, I guess following up a bit on Brian's actually just asked this question as well. I wanted to ask for advice on writing a dissertation, right? So Katie, you've just finished yours, and Ramon, I know you're a few years out from that, but if you want to share your thoughts as well, what are your tips on, I guess, planning a dissertation, writing it, and then trying to get it finished up? I'm gonna share.
Still muted. Yeah, so I guess as someone who's been more recently on this, so some things that it took me a very long time to get my dissertation done, in part because the scope of my project was never very well determined. And then I got midway through writing and got a null result, which wasn't like a like real null, wasn't they like there's nothing here, it was a your measurement wasn't any good kind of null, you know, like you did a bad study kind of thing. And then I had to like go back and like learn how to do video analysis. And in retrospect, I feel like that was kind of poorly handled. In the sense that I felt very frustrated because I went in expecting that my dissertation was going to be one thing, and then it completely changed, and it delayed me significantly. So first, I would say define your project well and kind of have an idea, if you can, of what your results are already to some degree, like some preliminary analysis at least, or at least don't hinge the whole dissertation around analysis you haven't done yet, I would say. And then once you kind of have that together, I think it does come down to, for me, it came down to breaking down this very large task into smaller subtasks. So things like writing an overall outline, or kind of writing the different chapters with some due dates that are realistic. And that's also something I really struggle with, is I like to make to-do lists with cute little checkboxes and colors and all that stuff, but then I put too many things on it. And then I get very disappointed at the end of the day or at the end of the week when I haven't checked off all the boxes and I have to push them to next week. And so one of the things that I found was really helpful was for me to be very realistic about my time. And what I actually did that worked well for me was I printed out the most bare bones calendar. I'm starting to do this because it worked for me so well last year over the winter break that I'm like, I should just do it again. This is like my very high-tech paper. So let me see if I can get it to show up right. It's too bright. Oh, okay, so it's just like days of the week and like a goal. And so like the next thing I'm gonna do with this is go and X out the days when I know I can't work. So, you know, talking about childcare, like my daughter's her daycare is closed on Monday. So X that out because that's not gonna happen. And like Christmas, not doing it. You know, it's a holiday and I want to hold that boundary. But that actually really helped me to say, okay, well, I really only have 4 days I can work this week. What can I reasonably accomplish in 4 days? And then if I get ahead, great, I can start on next week's thing. But like for that, like managing my emotions aspect, it was really helpful to have I'm going to say a generous to-do list with deadlines spread out of, here's how much time I think I need to get all of this done. And it takes a while. Like you can certainly I would encourage you to get feedback from your advisor if they're willing to give it, for like what's a reasonable amount of time to put into a dissertation chapter, for example, because it's easy to let that blow up and then you'll hear but not really internalize that the best dissertation is a done dissertation. But like, at least for me, it took a while to believe that. The other tip I'd also give is start with the easy chapters first. So like write your methods, right? Like save the intro. Like I think I wrote my introduction last. So I would definitely, yeah, like start with something easy. And then once you have your momentum going, then move to the hard stuff.
I would say to remember that your dissertation has to be just good enough to get a PhD. What actually matters are the publications. So as long as you pass the bare minimum bar that you can get that piece of paper that says PhD on it, I would get to that point, and then I would put the rest of the effort on submitting publications to top tier journals, to be quite honest. Because unfortunately the dissertation is necessary but not sufficient to get jobs. What will get you jobs are publications, grants, and speaking engagements. So that would be my recommendation. And I think, you know, I still get these monthly readerships of my dissertation, and it's, you know, it's not many people.
Well, thank you. Those are good tips from both of you. And let's see, the last question I have here is, what strategies do you use to collaborate with others?
I take kind of like the Voltron or Power Rangers approach for the 90s kids in the room, which is where we make an outline, we do our individual parts, and then we put it together. And then whoever the lead author is goes through and edits it and tries to get one voice and make it not seem like it's Frankenstein's monster. And then we do that sort of iteratively, and that seems to work okay. Other people have other approaches, so I'd love to hear from Katie.
Honestly, so far, I have pretty much written stuff where it's me writing and then some reviewing from colleagues, but it has been not, yeah, so I haven't done so much of the Voltron or multiple people writing. I'm looking to get into that more as I move forward in my career, but I know certainly something that Devin also is familiar with because we're situated in the same research group is that when in our group we have a paper that we feel like we're close to being ready to submit, we'll have the whole group read it, and possibly that's a group meeting for the week and to give feedback. And so that's really helpful. Not just because it's people that we have been collaborating with on a project, but also people who are on completely different projects to give a perspective that of peers, but not with the domain expert, the specific domain expertise.
All right, and then I guess I'd like to finish just by asking if there's anything else that you both would like to share.
Get your ideas out there because people are going to learn about you by running into your articles, whether it's an Inside Higher Ed, whether it's a talk at a conference, or whether it's a publication. So definitely just try to be as prolific as possible in writing and strategic.
Yeah, and I guess otherwise, as far as like the nuts and bolts of writing, find what works for you. If listening to the same song on repeat all day works for you to get in the zone, it does for me. My Spotify rewind was very weird this year. If that's what works for you, do it. If something else works for you, do it. But yeah, find the thing that lets you get in the zone and make it happen.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us for this panel. It's been super informative and helpful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share with the probably mostly graduate students who are going to be watching this and anyone else who's interested. So thanks a lot.